When it came to designing a series of cards for the Defect, I knew I'd need to focus around a new orb. Everything else we could support can be done on other characters, with the exception of other orb-focused synergies, but we can practice these techniques on our own orb. The orb I've come up with is the Toxic Orb, which brings the Silence Poison into the Defect's realm. The passive ability of the orb is to apply 2 poison to a random enemy. In theory, this equals the 3 damage power of the Lightning Orb, but is delayed over time. However, that poison can build over time against single opponents, allowing Toxic Orbs to become more powerful in long combat. The Evoke ability will be to apply 3 poison to a random enemy, and then trigger the poison on all enemies immediately. I wasn't sure how to accomplish this trigger when I came up with a design, but it turns out that it is possible. Like with cards and powers beforehand, I started by copying the default's custom orb code. This gives us a good framework, but let's take a look at each function before diving in too deep. Before the constructor, we have our class variables, mostly expected but with a small set for animation. The constructor sets up the evoke and passive variables and gets a random angle for the orb's animation. Update description updates the tooltip for the orb to apply appropriate values. Apply focus adds any needed modifiers to our orb's strength from the focus power. You'll notice we don't do anything with it right now. On evoke contains the code for the evoke, obviously, but the passive is stored in on start of turn. Update animation spins the orb and adds a sparkle effect every so often. This is then drawn in the render method. The important part here is that the orb graphic is expected to be 96 pixels square, so the rotation is done at the center, 48 pixels. I actually tried drawing my own orb, but I didn't have the dimensions right, so it was spinning in unexpected ways. Finally, we have the trigger evoke animation method, which does exactly that. Play channel sound effects, which plays the passive sound effect, and the requisite make copy function. Now that we're familiar with the layout of an orb, let's make our own. The things we really care about are the passive and evoke effects. I did try with both at start of turn and on end of turn, and the passive worked in both sections. Here, I grab a random monster using Abstract Dungeon's getRandomMonster function, then apply a poison power to it. I also copied over the flare effect from the default, but changed it to the plasma orb for effect. For on evoke, I also grab a random monster to apply the poison to, but then store a list of all monsters and iterate through it. For each monster, I check for the poison power. If that power exists, I use the poison lose HP action, using the found poison's amount value for the damage. In testing, this doesn't have quite the desired effect when the orb is evoked multiple times at once, but it'll do. Surprisingly, nothing else needs to be done to make orbs compatible with gold-plated cables and the emotion chip. I don't know if this is a byproduct of this particular method of implementation, or if it's due to some extra magic happening behind the scenes. However, focus doesn't work out of the gate. It took me way too long to figure out why focus wasn't applying. In Abstract Orb, the apply focus function gets the focus power and adds the value to our base passive and evoke values to give our new values. The defaults orb and the plasma orb both override the apply focus function to prevent this from happening. The dark orb also overrides the function in order to have it only apply to the passive value. We can remove our override and it will now scale properly. We'll need to add an orbs strings JSON file to our localization and make sure to load the orb in the main class. But now we need a way for the player to channel the toxic orb. The attack I designed for this is Lethal Injection, and it inflicts damage while channeling the orb, using the Channel Orb action. This design is similar to Ball Lightning and Cold Snap, which have fairly bland design to begin with. One of the other archetypes we could have played with is zero-cost cards, so let's add some synergy for that strategy. This card will deal a small amount of damage initially, but increase based on the number of zero-cost cards played. I found a function in Abstract card, On Play Card, which triggers when you play a card while the card is in your deck. I took advantage of this to keep track of the number of zero-cost cards played so far in the battle. By incrementing the base damage of the card for each zero-cost played, we add additional deck synergy. I decided to base the next two cards off of thematic ideas. What do the orbs represent for the Defect? I figure that they're various power sources that can be used in the constructs of the Spire, so maybe the toxic orb is analogous to a fossil fuel. The Defect then needs to vent the excess toxic gas created by this power source, so I designed the skill, Toxic Emissions, with that in mind. To support orb variety, let's base the value of the skill on the number of unique orbs the player has active, like with Compile Driver. The skill will apply one weakness and one vulnerable to the target for each unique orb. Looking into the source code, Compile Driver actually has its own action that it adds to the action manager. Looking into that action shows the process of getting the player's orbs and counting the number of unique members. Now that I've become more familiar with Megacrit's code structure, I almost came up with this on my own, but I didn't know quite what to look for to pull the active orb list. The power then built on the burning away of resources. Archaic Fuel channels a toxic orb whenever the player exhausts a card, done in the power's on-exhaust function. Unfortunately, I lost some creativity with this design, so there's nothing new to go over. Certainly, a second pass would not hurt in trying to make better cards, but we're trying to get through the characters at least once first. I was hoping to add card art this time around, but I didn't manage to. Part of it is indecision on the art style. Doing sketches and coloring them in Krita would be fast, but messy. Alternatively, I'm looking at making some 3D models, probably looking like the crappy game CG from 2000. But I could rig and reuse the models for multiple card arts. The more I look into this method, though, the better the hand-drawn style looks. I'm also seeing a shift in my own code style after working with this system. For the Brackeys 2020.2 Game Jam, I relied heavily on events and hooks, where before I tended to put too much into Unity's update function. I'm going to be moving on to the Watcher next, which should be an interesting challenge, since the default doesn't have custom stances.